Tonight we're going to discuss South Africa, and the obvious peg for that is the recent landslide re-election of the ANC. And Jacob Zuma, the leader of the ANC, is inaugurated as South Africa's new president on Saturday. So to discuss that and the future of South Africa, the future of the ANC government and maybe its consequences for the whole continent of Africa, how do you see the next 5, 7, 10 years for South Africa?
My instinct is that what we're going to see from Jacob Zuma, first of all, I think, and I'm going to use a little bit of the title of Alex's book, I think that what is happening within the ANC at the moment is that there is a battle for the soul of Jacob Zuma taking place in the ANC, because nobody knows exactly where Jacob Zuma stands. He fought the election very much as a champion of the poor, to whom perhaps enough has not yet been delivered. I think the ANC has actually delivered quite a lot in the 15 years of democracy in South Africa, but I would say that the sort of the poorest, probably 25% of the population, have been left out of a lot of the progress that has taken place. And he has positioned himself in contrast to Thabo Mbeki, and Zuma and his supporters often refer to Mbeki as the president and his briefcase carriers, to sort of caricature them as technocrats, as against, you know, here is a guy who grew up herding goats, very little formal education, understands the needs of the poor and will be able to deliver for them. But in policy terms, having worked with him for a number of years when he was a provincial minister for economic affairs, I think he's still something of a policy blank slate. He has said certain things about rural development. He said certain things about further widening the social grants net. But on the big issues, the big macroeconomic issues, I think he remains something of a policy blank slate. And he's been able to say to very different interest groups pretty much what they want to hear without, in essence, choosing sides. I think he is going to be a far more accessible leader in many ways, certainly initially. After the Thabo Mbeki years, he will seem more engaged with ordinary South Africans and ordinary ANC supporters. I have a very real fear, and I really am having to curtail this. So, as I said, I'll add more meat to it. But I have a very real fear that if things don't go well, either if some of his legal difficulties return, which they could, and I'll explain a bit more about that later, or if he isn't able to deliver, having said this is almost a new ANC government that you're now voting for, and if they're unable to deliver for those core supporters, that he might go back to some of his more instinctive political reactions, and there I have fears about his commitment to certain of the constitutional institutions. The independence of the judiciary would be one, that Parliament and various other organs play their constitutional role. This has all been eroded for years under Thabo Mbeki, and I just fear that Jacob Zuma could, in a sense, revert to type if things don't go well. And then I think towards the end of the 5 years, things could get a bit troubled.
I'm not sure if even Jacob Zuma knows what he stands for. And I haven't worked with Jacob Zuma, but I have spent quite a bit of time in his company in the last couple of years. And I met him a few times in the early 90s, but more important were these meetings in the last couple of years. And he talks an incredibly good game. He would tell you that Mbeki's policy on Zimbabwe, as he told me, was disastrous, and he'll tell you some entertaining stories about Mugabe. And you'll think, oh, good, so South Africa's controversial policy towards Zimbabwe is going to be better. He will tell you about HIV/AIDS, and despite his own hugely controversial utterances in the recent past on HIV/AIDS, I think that is one area which he will undoubtedly be completely different from Thabo Mbeki, and that it is incredibly important.
I am going to pick this scenario where I think he's going to be a pragmatist. He's going to do what will deliver for the shack dwellers, for the domestic workers, for the miners, and for the huge number of unemployed people, particularly the youths who voted for him. Because if he doesn't, he will have the cope to cope with. Even though, you know, COPE to have a lot of work to do. That's the opposition. In terms of him being in power for one term, he probably will, because by the time the election comes in 5 years' time, he would be 72 years old. So that is pretty, that is pretty old. So he probably will not. But again, he had said since that, well, it's left to the ANC, serves the ANC, and you know the ANC, you would know better than me, has this business of collective responsibility also. So it may or may not be there for another term. But also, I think internationally, I don't think South Africa the foreign policy will be any different from what operates now. I mean, because South Africa works with SADC. They're not going to go away from what SADC says. I mean, because if they were going to do that, they would have done so, you know, over Zimbabwe. But, you know, they didn't. And Zuma really did not deviate, even when he was not the head of state. Everybody's watching to see if Trevor Manuel will remain finance minister. After all, he is respected in the world, but some people are thinking that he may be moved to the planning commission, is it? That is one of the, I think, his big ideas, isn't it? Zuma's big ideas is to form a planning commission that hopefully would tie in all the strands of government and deliver for the people. But we'll have to see what happens when he names his cabinet, maybe next week or something.
And that sort of somewhat rare thing of a positive white South African in London. So it's easy for me to speak with some balance and a sort of positive outlook. I'm going to decline to speak on behalf of the ANC because I think that Andrew and Alec have summed it up quite well, which is to say we don't really know what they sort of stand for, certainly what Zuma stands for, and how how everything is going to sort of unfold in the next sort of weeks and months as the cabinet is formed and sort of policies are articulated. I think where we are now is a situation where you can look at the glass sort of half full or half empty. I think we forget how bad the Mbeki years were in some respects. And so I think to have broken with that is positive. I think more importantly we have ended the sort of logjam that we were in even before, but certainly post the Polokwane watershed when Mbeki essentially became a lame duck. And we've had, for the intervening period, a great deal of uncertainty and drift, which certainly hasn't stood the country in any stead. And you know, if you think of something like you know, the World Cup coming up, you think of pressing problems like addressing Eskom, the power crisis. You know, we've lacked the urgency and the leadership and the sort of steer that was needed to kind of push the country along. So I think that's very important that we've ended that, even though we don't yet know exactly what the future holds. I think that no one would deny, notwithstanding all of Zuma's you know, lack of clarity over his policy positions, I don't think anybody would deny that he is a man very comfortable in his skin. He is known for his conciliatory approach. He certainly has a very successful record in calming the warring factions in KwaZulu-Natal. Certainly he was instrumental in that. And given the extent to which, and we really only realize this in hindsight, how much Mbeki had sort of re-racialized the discourse in South Africa, I think it's very positive that Zuma has come along, and for the time being at least, he's taken a far more conciliatory line.